What if justice didn't break in the courtroom, but in the quiet places between edits where a gavel's echo fades and a muzzle flash becomes a confession? In the late-night hum of a projector, you can almost hear the law losing its breath. Case files curling like burned film. Sirens swallowed by the reel's soft rattle. A city learning that order is only a costume worn by fear. 5 thrillers stepped into that half-light and refused to look away. The judge who crossed the line, the assassin who carried a message no one wanted, the patriots who mistook rage for freedom, the soldier built to defend, turned back to destroy, the rescue that exposed the rot behind a flag. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. The 1,980 seconds were supposed to be the decade of control, a time when Hollywood heroes carried badges, not doubts. But beneath the chrome skyline and the neon justice of Reagan-era America, something darker was flickering through the reels. The war had followed them home. The streets looked clean, but the law was cracking from the inside out. Audiences were promised order, yet what they saw were men breaking it to survive. As studios chased simple patriotism, a handful of directors turned their cameras toward the system itself. Judges who killed for righteousness, soldiers who no longer knew whom they served, patriots who mistook vengeance for freedom. These weren't blockbusters built to entertain. They were confessions framed as thrillers, stories about what happens when rules collapse and morality becomes a matter of editing. By the end of the decade, most of these films had disappeared, cut, censored, or quietly shelved. But their ghosts still hum through late-night television, through grainy VHS copies and lost reels whispering that even justice can bleed. Let's rewind to the 5 films that crossed the line between entertainment and confession. Film 1. The Star Chamber, 1983. It begins in silence, a young judge sitting alone in his chamber, surrounded by stacks of case files that feel heavier than truth itself. The Star Chamber, directed by Peter Hyams, was released in 1983, a year when America wanted clean heroes. But this film dared to show justice in relapse, a courtroom thriller that slipped into the language of moral horror. Michael Douglas plays Judge Stephen Hardin, a man bound by the rules of a system that keeps releasing killers on technicalities. When one case too many collapses under procedure, he's invited into a secret circle, a brotherhood of judges who meet in a candle-lit room to pass judgment outside the law. They call themselves the Star Chamber. Their verdicts aren't written on paper. They're executed in blood. What began as righteous frustration turns to corruption disguised as duty. The film's real terror isn't in its assassinations, but in its logic, the comfort of deciding who deserves to die when the system fails. Every shot lingers too long, as if the camera itself were weighing a sentence. Critics called it a paranoid fantasy, but beneath the noir surface it whispered a truth too sharp for the decade. The law, when cornered by conscience, can become its own criminal. In the end, Judge Hardin tries to stop the machine he helped build. But justice once unleashed doesn't listen anymore. The law can punish, but it can never heal. Film 2, Day of the Assassin, 1979. The camera opens on heat and silence, a lone figure walking through the sunburnt ruins of Mexico, his shadow cutting sharper than the rifle on his shoulder. Day of the Assassin, 1979, directed by Brian Trenchard Smith, arrived in the last days of the Cold War's hangover, when every gunman was either a savior or a ghost. But this film lived somewhere in between. Henry Silva plays Slater, a professional killer hired for a political hit that spirals into betrayal. What looks like a simple action setup slowly unravels into something stranger, a portrait of a man who has seen too many justifications for murder. The targets change, the cause changes, but the method never does. When everyone believes they're serving justice, the assassin becomes the only honest man left. Trenchard Smith shot it like a fever dream. Washed-out light, long takes, and faces framed by the heat haze of moral exhaustion. The violence isn't choreographed. It's procedural, cold, deliberate, the way truth gets erased. And through it all, Silva barely speaks. His silence becomes the film's confession. The system makes killers, then pretends not to know their names. When the final bullet echoes across the ruins, it doesn't sound like victory, it sounds like memory. Day of the Assassin wasn't a hit, but it lingered, an artifact from a world where the messenger dies before the message can be understood. Sometimes truth needs a trigger. Film 3. Liberty and Bash, 1989. The decade was ending, and the heroes had turned mean. Liberty and Bash, 1989. Directed by Andre de Toth's son-in-law, took place in a Los Angeles where sunlight no longer felt clean. The film follows two vigilantes, Liberty, played by Miles O'Keefe, and Bash, played by Lou Ferrigno, ex-soldiers turned street enforcers who fight corruption with the same violence they once claimed to stop. It was released into a market saturated with muscle-bound justice, but this one felt different. Underneath the sweat and gunfire, the film carried a strange moral chill. Its opening scene, a camera gliding past graffiti that reads, "Freedom is a bullet with a flag on it, tells you everything." Liberty and Bash hunt drug dealers, crooked cops, and anyone who poisons the streets. But soon their cause becomes personal, then blind, then hollow. By the final act, it's impossible to tell who's protecting whom. Hollywood wanted a hero story. What it got was an autopsy on the American idea that violence could purify. The editing is jagged, scenes stitched like wounds, as if the movie itself can't decide whether it's propaganda or confession. Critics dismissed it as cheap action, yet its failures reveal its truth. When justice becomes private property, even freedom can turn fascist. Liberty and Bash weren't villains or saviors. They were just the final echo of a country trying to shoot its way back to innocence. When liberty kills, who will save freedom? Film 4. Bulletproof, 1988. It opens like a recruitment ad gone wrong, desert winds, metal gleam, soldiers framed against an endless horizon. Bulletproof, 1988, directed by Steve Carver and starring Gary Busey, was marketed as a simple military thriller. But behind its explosions and one-liners, it carried a message no studio dared to underline. Sometimes the armor isn't for protection, it's for denial. Busey plays Frank Bulletproof McBain, a tough ex-soldier assigned to recover a stolen supertank from a desert fortress. It sounds like standard, late, 80 seconds Patriot cinema. But the film's edges fray almost immediately. McBain isn't fighting for his country, he's fighting to remember why he ever did. The enemies are mercenaries, yes, but the real rot lies in the bureaucracy that sent him there. Orders are blurred, alliances crumble, and the mission turns into a mirror. Every frame is drenched in that anxious optimism of the era, the belief that firepower could fix what politics broke. Yet Carver films it like a fever dream, harsh light, too much sand, too many guns pointed at no one in particular. The humor feels forced. The hero weary a man built for a war that won't end, because it never truly began. By the final act, McBain's armor becomes symbolic, an unbreakable shell that keeps him alive but isolates him from meaning. He completes the mission, but the victory feels hollow, like an echo bouncing off a forgotten battlefield. The soldier they built to protect turned back to destroy. Not all armor was built to defend. Film 5. Omega Syndrome 2196. It begins with the sound of a scream fading into static. A girl kidnapped, a father left behind, and a system too slow to care. Omega Syndrome, 1986, directed by Joseph Manduke, feels like another revenge thriller on the surface. Yet buried beneath its low-budget grit lies a quiet indictment of American faith in authority. Ken Wall plays Jack Corbett, a Vietnam veteran haunted by the ghosts of a war that never ended. When his daughter is abducted by a neo-Nazi cult calling itself the Omega, he's forced to face not just his enemies but the failure of everything he once fought for. The police offer bureaucracy, not help. The government looks away. And so Corbett turns inward, his uniform now a relic, his morality a weapon sharpened by loss. Shot in harsh daylight and handheld panic, the film feels documentary real. Every punch lands with the sound of desperation, not heroism. Beneath its action lies something personal. A father realizing that evil doesn't always hide in jungles or deserts. Sometimes it hides in slogans, flags, and uniforms that looked too familiar. Critics dismissed it as exploitation. But the truth lingers in the quiet moments. Corbett's eyes staring into nothing after the rescue, knowing that justice saved one life but cost him the last of his faith. Omega Syndrome wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. They kidnapped the truth and called it patriotism. Every system hides an Omega, the end of what it believes in. Bonus fact: the Annihilators. 1985. Before the muscle heroes of the late 82nds stormed multiplexes, there was The Annihilators, a film so raw and relentless it was practically erased before it could even offend. Released in 1985 and directed by Charles E. Sellier, Jr., it followed a group of Vietnam veterans who reunite in Atlanta after one of their own is murdered by a street gang. They decide to clean up the city the only way they know how, with military precision and absolute rage. On paper, it's another low-budget revenge movie. But beneath its pulpy exterior, The Annihilators carried a message Hollywood couldn't handle: that America's obsession with war heroes had birthed a generation who no longer knew where peace began. The violence wasn't celebratory, it was mechanical, like men trying to replay the only part of life that still made sense. The cinematography turns alleys into war zones, and every explosion feels more like trauma than triumph. Censors and critics called it tasteless, too violent, too cynical. It disappeared into video shelves, buried by bigger, safer fantasies of glory. But in its final haunting moments, soldiers saluting in silence to no one in particular, it captured what many films of the decade refused to admit: that some victories destroy the victors. The Annihilators was never meant to win awards. It was meant to haunt the people who thought war was entertainment. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. Across these reels, from the shadowed courtrooms of the Star Chamber to the sun-bleached ruins of Day of the Assassin, from the urban chaos of Liberty and Bash to the scorched deserts of Bulletproof, and finally to the haunted quiet of Omega Syndrome, justice never wears the same face twice. Each film tried to speak the same forbidden sentence: that the system built to protect can also be the thing that destroys. Together they form a mirror, cracked, trembling, but clear enough to show how easily order becomes obsession and righteousness becomes ritual. Hollywood called them thrillers, but they were really confessions, stories that bled through their own edits. Beneath every gunshot and verdict, you can feel the pulse of a deeper truth: that justice is only light projected on a wall, and sometimes the real runs out before redemption begins. In the end, all that remains is contrast, frame and darkness, real and real, the flash of violence and the silence that follows. Because when the lights fade and the screen turns black, you're left wondering whether justice was ever more than another illusion, another story told to keep the audience calm, while the truth burned quietly behind the scenes. What if justice was never blind, just edited to look that way? These films remind us that the truth isn't always found in the verdict, but in the cuts no one was meant to see. The stories you just heard were buried beneath noise, politics, and fear, yet somehow they survived, flickering through damaged reels and midnight broadcasts to warn us that even morality can be rewritten in the edit room. So the next time you press play, look closer. What's missing from the frame might be what matters most: real secrets, where the truth was always in the edit.